All right, so it's my intention to speak for about 45 minutes, and then have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and then I guess we go off and get some wine, and you can buy books if you'd like. So let's just start right in. This is my favorite intersection of old New York. It was in my water book on the history of the creation of New York City's water supply. And it is the intersection of Greenwich and Day Streets. And it principally shows a mother helping a child get water from a street pump. And that was, I love the sense of what's going on there. This is way below the grid. It's only a few blocks north of here. And but that's not an intersection that I could see for most of my life, because the World Trade Center, the original World Trade Center footprint, got rid of that intersection. And I suppose if there's any upside from 9/11, not many, but if there's any, it's that intersection, which disappeared for so long, has returned. And it's in the process of returning. And that is Greenwich Street. That is Greenwich Street here, and that is Day Street here. That's the Calatrava affair over there. And this is essentially the continuation of Day Street. And if I have my bearings right, that woman was helping her child get water from a fountain right about there. So that got me thinking that the street orientation or organization of Manhattan is a little more plastic than we imagine, that street corners can come and go and come back again. And again, that's below the grid, but helped sort of inform my thinking about as I started formulating the idea for this book. So let's look at skylines. That's sort of the original skyline of New York, Dutch Manhattan in 1665. The highest point on the landscape, on the built landscape, is a windmill. We can go forward to Midtown in 1933, looking from the roof of the just completed RCA building. I think all the highlights there are pretty clear. And then we can jump ahead another 80 years or so to these wonderful images that just appeared in National Geographic in the digital online version, which gives us a sense of how Midtown is in the process of changing. And I don't know if you can really see it here, but 34th Street, Empire State Building, we're beginning to top. The yellow and orange are buildings that are being built or in the process of being approved and getting built. And if anybody sees the current National Geographic, the print version, a lot of this is in it, but especially the online, you can find it. It's fascinating stuff. And then you move a little bit further uptown within Midtown, and we get all sorts of things. And I'll be talking a little bit more about them. But what I note, and maybe you do too, is that all of these forms, no matter how high they rise into the sky, are all essentially rectangles. And they are essentially vertical extensions of the grid. No matter how high they go, they're tied to their rectilinear ground lot, and that rectilinear ground lot is determined by the rectangular block orientation of the city with the grid that was created in 1811. So, in a sense, all these fantastic buildings that are going up are, in some sense, slaves to the grid. The grid determines, in many instances, their shape. Some of them have been torqued around a little bit as they rise up, but essentially their bases are rectilinear. Okay, so let's go back a little bit now. This is Manhattan in 1797, and as you can see, downtown, not very much order. Essentially, streets in Manhattan were built by the landowner that owned the land. And the city government was relatively small, relatively passive. If a landowner wanted to put streets somewhere, the city government said, well, okay. And now the beginnings of rectilinearity happen here And this is essentially what was going to be the Delancey farm grid. And the Delancey family, and now the Lower East Side, the Delancey family in the 1760s owned all of this land, and they had an idea to develop it in a rectilinear way, in a grid, and sell off the land. That was in the 1760s. They hadn't gotten much accomplished before, and they were devotees of the king until we won the revolution and the Delanceys got thrown out. So their land was forfeited and sold off to New Yorkers. But that essential grittiness which the Delanceys first envisioned was created. So you have the beginnings of sort of grittiness in Manhattan. But still, this is a development that was essentially started as a private development. And there was still no indication that anything organized was going to happen in the city. The city, as I said, had really no control over its street making. Finally, for a number of reasons, which you don't have time to talk about, but are in the book, the city decided in 1807 to take control of its street destiny. And it got a law passed in the state legislature that gave a three-man commission absolute power and 4 years to decide whatever they wanted. They had one requirement, a minimum street width of 50 feet from a southern boundary along north, on the east side, along North, which is now Houston Street. It was called North Street for a reason, because everybody lived way below there. The North Houston Street in the early 1800s was far north of any extensive settlement. And that line continued from the east along North Street through the middle of the island, and then up along the northern boundary of the separate and long-established village of Greenwich. Greenwich was determined to be sacrosanct. You could not, the grid would not go below there. That changed a little bit during the 1900s, but maybe we'll mention that later. In any case, aside from having to make only streets 50 feet, minimum 50 feet wide, they could have done anything else that they wanted. They could have made those streets spirals. They could have made them serpentine. They could have made them anything they wanted. There was no requirement that whatever plan they came up with in 4 years be rectilinear. They also had no requirement to report any of their progress, or even when they turned in their plan in 1811 to explain it. In fact, as I'll say in a moment, what they did turn in was an incredibly brief set of explanatory remarks, not even a formal report. So, who are the commissioners? We'll talk about that in a moment. Just remember this, just as a minor aside. John Rutherford with an O. He hated that because he actually spelled his name with a U. But we'll get to him in a moment. So the guy who really runs the commission is Gouverneur Morris. Basically, in stages of his life, as a young man who was one of the major figures at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Earlier than that, he acquired a peg leg, which is depicted in a later image in the middle, apparently escaping from a window of a boudoir, right? And it is amply documented that that he continued his amorous ways, often with married or unmarried, but always willing women. He was not a hunter, but he was apparently very attractive to women, and his peg leg was made ample use of in those affairs. You get what I mean, right? That is well documented. Finally, as he was getting older in 1810, that's where the image on the right is from, he suddenly got married to the great dismay of his many relatives who were waiting in line to inherit all of his money. I should note that he lived in an estate in the opposite Upper Manhattan on the mainland, which is now the Morrisania section of the Bronx. So it was a beautiful estate when he had it. It's now, has been for a long time, a decidedly down market section of the South Bronx. So that's Morris in his wedding portrait from 1810. Did I say that? That's his wedding portrait from 1810. Looking quite satisfied with himself. Made his relatives very angry. And so here are other three people that we need to be concerned about. In the middle is John Rutherford, F-U-R-D. He is on the commission basically because he's related to Gouverneur Morris. He's the largest landowner in New Jersey. He's the only one of the three commissioners born in Manhattan, but he spent pretty much all his life in New Jersey tending to his vast estate lands. I've spoken to relatives today who still, sigh when his name is spelled O-R-D. But in fact, the town that's there in New Jersey, on where his lands were, is spelled with an O. That's just one of basically from the vagaries of cursive and pronunciation. And then on the left is and Rutherford's sort of the least important of the commissioners. He rarely attended their meetings. He was often off somewhere else. They needed two commissioners to make decisions, two of the three, which was something that they found very hard to do often, because and I should note that Morris, during this period, as he's aging, is beginning to suffer from extensive physical infirmities like gout and urinary tract infections and things like that. He's often in bed for weeks on end, and when he's not in bed, he's up in upper New York State, touring his various estate lands. On the left, Simon DeWitt, nominally the second most important of the commissioners. He is for 50 years the State Surveyor General of New York State. He's from Albany. He really likes being in Albany. He doesn't really very like much being in New York. In his 4 years on the commission, he, by my reckoning, spent about 5 days a month in New York working on the commission. He submitted an expense report in 1811 in which he enumerated the number of days that he spent doing commission business. The commissioners were entitled to $4 a day for their services. Rutherford and Morris, being wealthy, said, "We don't need the money." DeWitt asked for the money. He also submitted what we'd call a T&E report, travel and expense report. He wanted to be compensated for his transportation costs going back and forth to Albany, and he wanted to get his $4 for every Sunday that he had to spend in New York when Sabbath laws prevented transportation from taking him back to Albany. He just didn't like being here. The Common Council, the city government, gave him his travel expenses, but they denied him Sabbath pay. And the guy on the right, John Randall, Jr., the chief surveyor for the commissioners. He is the guy that essentially followed their orders, such as they were whenever they actually happened. And he only served for 3 years, because for the first year, 1807 to 1808, the commissioners actually hired a local surveyor who was actually pretty terrible. And eventually they had to fire him and bring Randall down from Albany, where he was the young protege of Simon DeWitt. So Randall, the guy who actually does the physical surveying of Manhattan, is not a New Yorker. Doesn't really much go for New York things like his mentor, and also is 20 years old. And he's an excellent surveyor and a pretty exacting and difficult person. Now, what happens during these 4 years, 1807 to 1811? In sum, very little. As best I can tell from what the relatively few written records there are, which is mostly Morris's diaries and letters, they didn't really work very much on what they were doing. And in fact, beginning in 1810, in the very important final year of their 4-year commission, Simon DeWitt and Gouverneur Morris are appointed to the much more important commission on the Erie Canal. And so you can see Morris in his papers not paying much attention to the Manhattan Street Commission, 1807 to 1810, and then all of a sudden throwing himself into the Erie Canal Commission. And so in early March of 1811, Morris submits a very long and detailed report with all sorts of engineering specifications and all sorts of elaborate writing. Early March, he hands in that report. That report is on the Erie Canal. 3 weeks later, with time running out on their commission, he submits an 11-page a set of explanatory remarks on the grid that they've come up with. So, greatest grid, I don't know if anybody saw the exhibit, greatest grid. And here's what it looked like. Very hard to reproduce here, especially in the light, but I think many, if you're here, you probably have some idea of what that is. As you can see, hopefully, no Central Park, no Broadway. We'll dig in a little closer. No Central Park. Broadway, this is a thing called the parade that the commissioners envisioned beginning at what they called 23rd Street up to what they called 34th Street. Here is the original Broadway, and it pretty much dies right there at the beginning of the parade. After a few years, the parade is pretty much legislated out of existence, and the only thing left of it is Madison Square, considerably smaller than what the commissioners envisioned. But above it, no Broadway. Okay? So, why right angles only? They didn't have to do it. From their explanatory remarks, and I always have to put those explanatory remarks in quotes because they didn't really explain very much, but they did say some things. So, why right angles only? Quoting from the remarks, presumably written by Morris, but strangely written in the third person, as if they were, even in their remarks, distancing themselves from what they wrote. Quoting, one of the first objects which claimed their attention was the form and manner in which the business should be conducted. That is to say, whether they should confine themselves to rectilinear and rectangular streets, or whether they should adopt some of those supposed improvements by circles, ovals, and stars, which certainly embellish a plan, whatever may be their effect as to convenience and utility. In considering that subject, they could not but bear in mind that, here's the important line, a city is to be composed principally of the habitations of men, women I suppose also, and that straight-sided and right-angled houses are the most cheap to build and the most convenient to live in. The effect of these plain and simple reflections was decisive. Well, they don't exactly explain why they were decisive, but that is their explanation. Now, why so few open spaces? And again, it's kind of hard to see here. There are a few open spaces. We have the parade, and there's some other smaller spaces right there, and another one right there, but nothing large. So, it may, quoting now from the remarks, it may be to many a matter of surprise that so few vacant spaces have been left, and those so small for the benefit of fresh air and consequent preservation of health. Certainly, if the city of New York was destined to stand on the side of a small stream, such as the Seine or the Thames, a great number of ample places might be needful. But those large arms of the sea, they didn't name them, but like the Harlem River and the East River, large arms of the sea, which embrace Manhattan Island and render its situation in regard to health and pleasure, as well as to the convenience of commerce, peculiarly felicitous. So, water surrounding us, we don't need a big play space in the middle. And needless to say, of course, the situation was not so felicitous as not to require Central Park 40 years later. We'll get to how Central Park came to be. So now let's go uptown to the northern part. They quit at 155th Street, what they called 155th Street. They had authority to go all the way up over the whole island. So why'd they quit? They explained, in quotes, to some, it may be a matter of surprise. They did assume that everybody reading their remarks would be surprised. To some, it may be a matter of surprise that the whole island has not been laid out as a city. To others, it may be a subject of merriment that the commissioners have provided space for a greater population than is collected at any spot on this side of China. They have, in this respect, been governed by the shape of the ground. It is improbable that for centuries to come, the grounds north will be covered with houses. Improbable. To have come short of the extent laid out might have defeated just expectations. To have gone further might have furnished materials to the pernicious spirit of speculation. And that's pure Gouverneur Morris writing. So they thought above 155th Street would be a zone of speculation. Well, certainly below 155th Street was an amazing zone of speculation. In fact, John Jacob Astor, for one example, he made a lot of money in the fur shipping business. He got rich in the fur shipping business. In 1830, he quit that and started buying up land in Manhattan. And that's what made him the richest man in America. Land that was ordained to become part of the grid. And he just bought up just vast portions of it and then made loads of profit selling it off. Now, so this grid map of 1811 is sort of a flat thing. It doesn't really tell us anything. It just is lines on a map of the island. When you, again, dig down a little bit, and hopefully you can see this, what you see is that there are many more lines than the streets and avenues of the commissioners. They are property lines that have been on the island for generations. And this is a detail of one of the maps that John Randall produced. When the commission was done in 1811, basically all it had submitted was a map. There was no way to actually turn that into reality. And so Randall was hired by the city, and for the next almost 10 years, did incredibly detailed maps of the entire island, showing where the streets should go and what was in the way. And what we have here is sort of the southern middle boundary of the grid. This is Greenwich Avenue going up here. This is Art Street, which sort of became 8th Street. This is what became Washington Square. You can see, the overlay of grittiness, but you can also see incredibly many more lines of property. And here's a little bit more detail. And so you can see the Bowery and Broadway sort of mingling here in something that they did. They just called it Union Place. Only later did it become a more formal thing. Randall, his grid work was really the highlight of his career. He had a long decline, eventually died broken and long impoverished in 1864. But just before he died, he called the grid, quote, the pride and boast of the city. But he also admitted, quote, the time within which the commissioners were limited by the statute to make their plan of the streets and avenues on Manhattan was barely sufficient to enable them to comply with the letter and not fully with the spirit of the statute. So even the surveyor is saying very late in life, essentially the 1811 plan was handed in basically right against a deadline without much thought having gone into it. Let's move forward, because I think I'm moving too slowly. So, 1811, the plan is announced, and curiously, there's not much objection to it in the beginning, until this fellow writes an anonymous pamphlet. And he says, well, I'll tell you who he is in a moment. He writes in an anonymous pamphlet that the commissioners were, quote, men who would have cut down the 7 hills of Rome. We live under a tyranny with respect to the rights of property which no monarch in Europe would dare to exercise. Our public authorities seem unwilling to depart from their leveling propensities, but proceed to cut up and tear down the face of the earth without the least remorse, and apparently with no higher notions of beauty and elegance than straight lines and flat surfaces placed at angles with the horizon, just sufficient to suffer the mud and water to creep quietly down their declivities. Now the writer is, and the fellow pictured here is the guy who wrote that famous Christmas song a number of years later, Visit from St. Nick, over the river and through the wood. So this is Clement Clarke Moore. He was pretty angry for a little while, and then he realized, maybe I should actually let all these streets go through my big estate and then divide up all the new blocks into lots and sell them off and make lots of money, which is in fact what he did, and his estate of Chelsea was thus divided and survives as the Chelsea neighborhood on the west side. Now, many others didn't see the wisdom that Moore picked out, and they fought for decades, but to little avail, essentially because the state law was, for the most part, sacrosanct. I mean, there was no way to change it. It was a state law. And so most landowners who objected, and I should note, as we saw from the property lines, Manhattan was a largely owned place. It wasn't highly settled, but most of it was owned for generations. Farms, country estates and whatnot. And most of the people who lived there were very upset that they were going to have streets run through their property. Many of them sued, and they all lost. The only people who actually had some success were the people who lived along what was called Bloomingdale Road, which was essentially the north and westerly extension of Broadway. And they had their properties were right along that old road, originally a native path. They progressively, over several decades, managed to have Bloomingdale Road inserted into the grid plan as Broadway. And that's how Broadway actually comes into the grid plan, through objections to it by landowners who lived along the original road. So let's move quickly. I hope you can see that. This is a map from 1852, and what it shows you, the dark spots, is that the first development really was along the west side, along 8th and 9th Avenues. 8th and 9th Avenues. The dark spots are development. The east side, very, very few streets actually laid, and that is 42nd Street there, the Croton Reservoir. Very few streets here in 1852. This changes, and you'll note, by the way, that Broadway is beginning to assert itself. Where is it? Where did Broadway go? There it is. Broadway is beginning to assert itself. Right? Now we go ahead. That was 1852. 1879, I had to put it sideways. There was no way to make it fit. And look what we have. Now the west side is lagging, and the east side is fully developed. Spectacular change over 25 years. And, of course, what do we have in the middle? The anti-grid. Within its rectangular boundaries, this amazingly serpentine place called Central Park. We'll talk about Central Park in a moment. Let's head back downtown. This is 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. 5th Avenue and 42nd Street in 1847. That is the Croton Reservoir, which I mentioned earlier, way out essentially in the suburbs, which started bringing water to New Yorkers who lived way down there. And of course, it was a popular spot, suburban spot for people to go and walk around this walkway at the top of the reservoir. There's a little parapet there. And one of the people who did so 2 years after this drawing was Walt Whitman, who walked around the reservoir's walls in November of 1849, and he wrote, "The elevated and stony grounds about here will cost their owners dearly to get them graded and paved. It is a pity that greater favor is not given to the natural hills and slopes of the ground on Manhattan Island. Our perpetual dead flat and streets cutting each other at right angles are certainly the last things in the world consistent with beauty of situation. 50 years later, 50 years after that, we have, boom, it's a city, just 50 years later. And that is the Croton Reservoir, as it's about to, in its last years, it's been emptied to be replaced by that, the New York Public Library. I guess everybody is nodding, right? We knew that that was coming, right? And that is sort of one of these rare places of civic beauty in Manhattan, because it really was reservoir ground beforehand. It was sort of excluded, in a sense, from the grid. Now, Whitman, of course, was not alone in his sensitivities about the grid. Among the also sensitive, similar to Whitman, was a fellow who lived in a rented room in this farmhouse on the Upper West Side, Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote in 1844, he wrote The Raven in one of these rooms, not sure which, maybe there. And he also wrote, I've been roaming far and wide over this island of Mannahatta, the sort of the poetic name for him. The spirit of improvement has withered magnificent places with its acrid breath. Streets are already mapped through them. They are no longer suburban residences, but town lots. In some 30 years, the whole island will be densely desecrated by buildings of brick. Oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to show them to you. There we go. Densely desecrated by buildings of brick with portentous facades of brown stone. And certainly 30 years later, Poe was gone, and this is what happens to the farmhouse. It is about to go. Broadway here. Its hill that it was on has been cut down. We have just sort of a rickety staircase going up to it, and clearly this farmhouse is in its last days. Central Park. We talked about it. I talked about it a little bit before. I like this image because it shows, it's a contrast between the rectilinearity of everything surrounding it and the total serpentineness. Is that a word? Inside it. It was designed, of course, by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. Olmsted was another grid hater. He wrote, the time will come when New York will be built up, all the grading and filling done, the picturesquely varied rock formations converted to rows of monotonous straight streets and piles of erect angular buildings. There will be no suggestion left of its present varied surface, with a single exception of the few acres contained in the park. He was being modest. It was 873 acres out of Manhattan's 14,000 acres or so. Okay, so let's hopefully quickly here, get a sense of what's going on the ground. We got a little bit of it earlier. Here's some more. That's sort of self-explanatory, except that you need to know the year, 1868. The hills which I've been talking about are all being chopped down. 6th Avenue between 55th and 57th. These are squatter shacks, or essentially short-term rentals by landowners who are just waiting for the hill to be cut down and make use of their land. Obviously, this is 100 years later. It's the corporate architecture of 6th Avenue, or what some people call the Avenue of the Americas. Here's one of my favorites. This is obviously also a newly cut street, right? We have the rock that's been blasted away. The street isn't yet paved. The squatter shacks up here. They'll go away soon. This is 1882. It's 70th Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. And 16 years later, same block. Looks like it's been there forever. It's just amazing how quickly the grid made city happen. Let's go further north on the west side. This is 1880. We're looking west from 8th Avenue. This is going to be 86th Street pretty soon. This is a farm down in a valley. All the hills around it will be thrown into the valley, and 86th Street will be made. 9th Avenue L. And, interesting structure here, a lot line building. This is the front of the building here, multifamily building. This is going to be looking out on 86th Street here. No windows on the east side of the building. Why? What's that?
New building.
There'll be another building exactly like it, right next to it. Exactly. This is a nice contrast, also from 1880. I don't know the precise street, but you get a sense of, here's a nice upper middle class building with apparently a mansard roof. Right next to it is the hill, or the rocky hill that preceded it. Here are the remnants of it. The hill is actually higher than this 7-story building. So you get a sense of what Manhattan looked like before the grid started flattening it. And a question everybody asks, if you have lots of hills, you have lots of valleys. Where did the valleys go? Well, the hills were blasted away and dumped into the valleys, and essentially that's how the island is flattened. Here's a wonderful image. This is 3rd Avenue and 46th Street in 1868. I love this one. This is 3rd Avenue here, and this is 46th. And this is the excavation for a big new building. If it's maybe hard to see here, but it sort of reminds me of Bruegel's. Everybody is just in mad activity. They're all covered with muck, and they're blasting things out, and they're spraying. They're trying to drain water out, and it's a fairly crazy scene. But this again is how city is made when you have a grid that determines pretty much where everything should go. So that's 3rd Avenue and 46th in 1868. Let's jump a century ahead. 3rd Avenue and 3rd Avenue and 46 is like over here. And here's the grid complete. This is a map, an axonometric map done for the 1964 World's Fair. And what you now begin to get the sense of is the grid is filled on the horizontal plane. And where does it go? It has nowhere to go, and it may not be so easy to see in this image, but basically it starts to go up. It is now moving into the vertical plane. All right? Oh, good. Last page, 37. We're at minute 37. And needless to say, we have this going on in Midtown in 1964, and ultimately, of course, what you get is so, yeah. Carol's not saying that. 432 Park. As I see it, we now have essentially the grid on the horizontal plane taken to perverse extremes. Sorry, Carol. Skylines were first dominated by church spires in New York and elsewhere. In New York later by commercial buildings, the Woolworth Building, Singer, the Chrysler Building, Empire State Building, even the World Trade Center. Buildings about commerce. This is a building about, I don't know what it's a building about. It's about people who are not going to live there in empty condos. Again, sorry, Carol. This is the hard part. If anybody saw Adam Gopnik's piece in The New Yorker in October, when he very nicely did me the favor of mentioning the book, like even before it was published, and that helped get it some attention. He called this building, did anybody read the article? No. He called this building the oligarch's erection. Sorry. Also, Martin Filler the architecture critic in the New York Review of Books. He was talking about all of these new stacks that are coming. He called them, I mispronounce this word all the time. Thank you. Say it again. Atoliated oddities. Okay? Now, in my book, because I'm focused on the grittiness of all this, and perhaps less felicitously than Gopnik and Martin Filler, I call this building and others like it, quote, the weird progeny of incestuous rectilinear generations. All right. But, the architect of it, 432 Park, architect Raphael Vinoli, he loves his building. He loves the grid that essentially spawned it. He says of the grid, quote, it is the best manifestation of American pragmatism in the creation of urban form. That's good, right? Okay. Another grid lover, Corbusier, right? He wrote in 1947, the streets are at right angles to each other and the mind is liberated. I insist on right-angled intersections. So we have Corbusier, so we have lovers and we have haters and lovers, and then we have people sort of caught in the middle. And I love the transition from his gaze to this one with similar glasses. I should have put these together. We know who that is? Good old Jean-Paul Sartre. He visits New York for the first time in 1946. He writes that he is at ease if he's walking quickly, but, quote, if I stop, I get flustered and wonder, why am I on this street rather than one of hundreds like it? And at the seemingly certain corner of Lexington and 52nd, he writes, this spatial precision is not accompanied by any emotional exactitude. So, the grid, an existential dilemma for Jean-Paul. Let's go back a little bit in history, sort of a similar image to one we saw earlier, but I love this because this is the past and the future. And this is 1861, and it is 2nd Avenue, which has been newly laid, and 42nd Street. And here we have a country estate. All of this hill here was one time presumably belonged to it, right? All of this hill here, but the hill is gone. The house can only be accessed now by a rickety staircase leading up to it. The front porch is falling off into 2nd Avenue. And where the folks who live there probably once looked out at a beautiful wooded vista. Maybe they even saw New Jersey from there. Now they look out at a multi-family lot line building similar to the one we saw up on 86th Street a little while ago. And again, lot line building with the windows on the street, no windows now on the south face because there's going to be another building like it. But look, New Yorkers enjoy it. They're out promenading in their strange new city. All right? Remember that image and then go to this. There it is. Look, Ma, it's colored. Colorized, right? Like Ted Turner with movies. And I thank the art department of my publisher for just sort of like adding color to an old image like that. But I think what it does by colorizing that image, it shows us, in a sense, that the old can be new, like the intersection of Greenwich and Day. And that what's old, like the grid, may possibly be made anew one day. Thanks. 44 minutes and 20 seconds. All right, now questions. So fire away. Yes.
I have a question. Can you comment on how early zoning or the concept of zoning came into the grid, or how that balanced into the thinking, or did?
The first zoning is 1916. right? And the second zoning,
But was it earlier than that? Did they talk about that kind
not
of
really,
talk?
no. What happened was, again, there was sort of rampant building as high as could possibly be, similar to, in a sense, to what's happening now. And the 1961 zoning law, essentially, as you probably know, began to require setbacks. So we got the
16, you just said 16.
I'm sorry, 16. Sorry, I guess I'm dyslexic. But I like that the two zoning laws, one is 1916, the other is 1961. So it's sort of like a little treat for dyslexics. So 1916 is the first zoning law in the country, and what it does is require that buildings have setbacks. So we don't have darkened streets running throughout Manhattan. And then that was relatively effective. And then the 1961 zoning law, which I think most people would argue was less effective, but that essentially required that the whole building be set back, but it could go higher. And so you had more public plazas and things like that.
They did talk
No, it
about
didn't
it.
require,
Well,
it didn't require that. It offered an incentive for
Correct.
setback in order to create public space in the ground plane.
Better said than I. Next.
I'm curious about how the grid impacted the establishment of neighborhoods. Or like making sure that that all the essential services were provided within a given area. Because if you just look at the grid,
Mhm.
it's not. It makes Manhattan look like one giant neighborhood. But then
Yeah.
essentially it got broken up
Mhm.
into
Well-
smaller, more manageable.
Maybe one of the things that helped do that was the wide streets, 14th, 23rd, 34th, and all that. And if you want to ask me why those wide streets are where they are, I can't tell you. Nobody's been able to figure it out. It was one of those things in the explanatory remarks that the commissioners did not explain. They're seemingly in random places. As you get north, they get more regular, 86, 96, 106, but then 110, and then 125, 35, 45, 55, right? But 79th, why?
Did that have to do with
72nd,
places?
why? Nope, this is 1811,
Before, no.
right.
They were already
So-
connected with Broadway.
Well, Broadway wasn't in the plan.
Yeah, but afterwards, when
Afterwards,
Broadway
well,
went
the
to
beauty,
down road.
the beauty of Broadway is that we get that diagonal and we get some of these sort of random spaces, and we get all these great intersections of Madison Square, and we get the Flatiron Building, we get Times Square, or Herald Square, Times Square, Columbus Circle, Lincoln Square and Lincoln Center, but that's it for Manhattan. Broadway's the only diagonal. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question.
Kind of, yeah, because I guess the major streets do break up the city into neighborhoods.
I think so, to some extent. And also the avenues themselves, which are so far apart.
The L train goes.
And right, right.
Are Madison and Lexington on the original?
Oh, yeah. I always figure somebody will ask, so I don't just put it in there. They were not in there. And one of the things I didn't mention here, but is in the book, is like, how did the commissioners actually come up with their grid plan? What they did was they basically stole an earlier plan that had been developed in the 1790s for a central part of the island called the Common Lands, which was the least desirable part of the island, roughly from 23rd Street and then roughly up 3rd Avenue, where 3rd Avenue and 7th Avenue would eventually be, up to about 90th Street. And these were called the waste unpatented and something else lands. And they were actually given to the city by the Dutch government. And so all these property lines that we saw earlier that go up, that are in the lower part of the grid area and up the west and the east, the land in the middle of the island was actually owned by the city and entirely undeveloped because it was the worst land in the city. That was the rockiest land and of course with the most valleys, most of them filled with swamps and streams and things like that. And in the 1780s and 1790s, the city said, okay, we've had these about 1,300 acres. Why don't we try to make some money off them? Because the city government didn't have very much money post-war, post-revolution. And they hired a surveyor named Casimir Gork, G-O-E-R-C-K, who's notable only because he was married to a Roosevelt who was a direct forebear of the two presidents. But he died in 1798 of yellow fever. He laid out the common lands with 3 north-south roads, east, middle, and west, and he put them 920 feet apart. And he was told that what he needed to do was those 3 roads, and he needed to make divide up all of these 1,300 acres or so, the common lands, into 5-acre lots. So, if you have 920 feet between the 3 roads, and you want to make 5 acres, very roughly, the other dimension is going to be 260 feet. So what he did was make 5-acre lots that were 920 feet east-west and 260 feet north-south, and also said that anyone who bought those lots should know that at some point a 60-foot street may be taken from your 260 feet. 60 feet may be taken from it for a cross street. Now, none of those cross streets were actually ever made. And in fact, by the early 1800s, very few of the common lands lots had actually been sold. It was highly undesirable land. 1811, the commissioners announced their plan, and 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue, and 6th Avenue are 920 feet apart, and exactly where Gork's east, middle, and west streets are. And those 60-foot streets of Gork's that never got built, that's exactly where the 60-foot cross streets of the 1811 grid are. And so basically what the grid commissioners did is, without acknowledging it at all in their explanatory remarks, which pretty much proves that they did steal it, they essentially took this central plan and expanded it out over the whole island. And that was sort of the extent of their inspiration.
So Broadway right after the church there, Grace Church,
Yeah.
14th Street makes a left-hand turn
Mhm.
and continues in northwestern direction. But I read that there was an impetus for that left-hand turn. It didn't just happen. Maybe an Indian took a left turn there, walking. He had maybe the Lancey had a house over there that had gotten away.
I can't remember why there is that left-hand turn there. It's not really. I can't answer the question why that left-hand turn is there. It was just that's the way the street had developed as it led up toward its intersection with the Bowery. Do you know, Carol? I don't remember.
A story that I don't remember.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. You have to go to Wikipedia for that one. Maybe. Hi.
Quick question. You mentioned about why the West Village didn't develop
Mhm.
on the grid, and then I didn't hear the explanation. But you were saying you were going to talk about it later, and then I just...
Oh, I'm sorry. Why
Why the West Village
was
didn't
excluded?
develop-
Because the village of Greenwich developed separately from the city, and it was well established by the early 1800s as a separate village, and it was just determined that it just didn't seem right to plow the grid through it. It was a very settled little village, and it would have been difficult to throw everyone out. It was much easier to lay down a grid where people might have owned land, but not many people actually lived. And then, of course, in the 1920s, 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue were run right through the village, where they had not been allowed to run before, depriving the village of some of its special character, but enough of it is still retained. Yep.
Sorry if you talked about this already, I came in a little late, but do you know why 60 feet was the width that people were talking about, even way back then?
Yeah.
When there weren't vehicles parked.
Well, again,
Roads and
yeah, again, the commissioners were told that they only had to make their streets 50 feet. But they had that Gork plan, which said that there ought to be 60-foot streets going through all these 5-acre, 260 feet by 920 feet blocks or lots. So I think they just chose 60 feet because Gork had dreamed them up about 15 years earlier. They didn't explain it. It's not, nowhere is there any explanation as to why the avenues why there are just 12 of them. There probably should be twice as many. Oh, I didn't answer about Madison and Lexington. You asked that before, right? I'll get back to that. Why there are just 12 of them, why they're 100 feet wide, why the streets are 60 feet wide. I think we know why they're 60 feet wide because they basically cadged what Gerk had done. So I think, does that answer your question?
Really, because they could
What-
have decided that early surveyor had streets that were too wide. They could have just rejected it and decided that they were going to use streets that were as wide as the West Village streets typically are, or even streets that are as wide as a lot of the side streets in Lower Manhattan, for instance, that were presumably serving just fine and would have allowed more land for development within the grid.
I won't argue with you,
Yeah,
but there's no answer.
it's worked out pretty well. The 60 feet seems to be a good size for modern use.
Not if you drive. Not if you have to bring a truck into the city and make deliveries. Not if you have to clear streets that are blocked with snow. 60 feet to me seems pretty narrow. So do even 100-foot avenues seem pretty narrow. So does the lack of any diagonals seem unfortunate. And so does the lack of maybe twice as many north-south routes. But that's just my opinion. Madison and Lex, those again were these avenues that were between 4th and 5th was 920 feet. Between 3rd and 4th was 900. Yeah, between 3rd and 4th was 920 feet. Between 4th and 5th was 920 feet. Between 5th and 6th was 920 feet. In 1831, a guy named Samuel Ruggles decides to buy up some land where and turns it into what's now Gramercy Park. And if you remember from that 1852 map I showed, most of the early development was on the west side, not on the east side. So in the early 1830s, very few streets had been laid there. And so Ruggles has this idea to make sort of a private little development. He buys up a lot of lots. But his development sort of drifts between 3rd and 4th Avenues. So he says to the city, how about if you make me a little avenue going from 14th Street up to my development? And, hey, we'll name it after Washington Irving. And the city says, well, okay. And then they say, well, if we're going to make a road, a north-south avenue leading to your development, why don't we just continue it beyond your development and let's call it, let's name it after the Battle of Lexington. And so that's how Lexington Avenue comes to be. And a year or so later, they realize it's not such a bad idea to split these very long blocks with intervening parallel avenues. And Ruggles and others essentially come up with the idea for Madison Avenue. And that's how that comes to be. And if you're wondering why no avenue ever split 5th and 6th, it just never happened. The mayor in 1910, William J. Gaynor, had the idea of doing it, but by that time, of course, the city was entirely built up. He, on the front page of the Sunday Times magazine in June or July of 1910, had a illustrated proposal for a new avenue between 5th and 6th, going from 14th to 59th. And of course, real estate interests are up in arms, especially the owners of all the buildings that would have to be destroyed. And he promoted the plan heavily for a couple of months, and then he got shot. But not by a disgruntled landowner. By a dock worker who had been fired, who was crazy-ish, and thought that Gaynor was responsible. And Gaynor survived actually for another 3 years with a bullet lodged in his neck, but he stopped promoting his avenue. And that was the last shot at putting an avenue between 5th and 6th. Yep. So go ahead.
My memory about Robert Moses' proposals to alter the grid and how his proposals were
Yeah.
stopped.
He didn't really want to alter the grid. He just wanted to put highways through Manhattan. And the deal with Robert Moses is when he was just coming into power, what he did was he was the champion of the car, and he displaced the earlier and older, and I think probably at that point much wiser champion of the railroad. Wilgus, what was his first name? William, right? Yeah, William Wilgus, who would have essentially serviced Manhattan with all sorts of rail coming to areas surrounding the island. For example, one of the projects that Wilgus was involved with was a rail tunnel underneath the Verrazano Narrows. Moses turned that into the Verrazano Bridge. No rail, but cars. And so I think one of the early problems with Moses is he was a champion of the car. And he is, the grid itself, it lends itself to congestion, and Moses certainly didn't help things along.
Let me put a plug in for Thursday night at the Municipal Archives. There's a lecture on, as a companion to an exhibition that they have called LOMEX, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which is the Moses project to cut across Canal Street. So I got an email that said there's still some seats available, and it's a free lecture, so you can take advantage of that. I have a question.
Uh-oh.
So you didn't mention tonight, but you
Yeah.
did mention in the book one
Yeah.
of a commentator on the grid who celebrates it, and that's Rem Koolhaas.
Sure.
In
Deliriously.
one of the greatest books that has ever been written about New York, which is called Delirious New York. And there he talks about the relentless diversity of
Yes.
the grid,
Mm-hmm.
which would seem to be the opposite of the interpretation that you offer of monotony.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think Koolhaas is absolutely right. There is no place which is more diverse than Manhattan. If you walk across town, across any cross street, you will not see monotony. You
Right.
will see enormous diversity. How do you explain that?
He's an architect. Architects love the grid. It's so easy. Intellectuals generally don't like it. Academics, all the academics don't like the grid. John Reps at Cornell, Vincent Scully at Yale, Peter Marcuse at Columbia, who called the grid, I can't remember the quote, basically one of the worst city plans in the world, in the civilized world. And the other two guys I mentioned had similar quotes. We could have had a much more interesting island, and that still would have conveyed or allowed the city to become a powerful place. It could have looked more like Paris. There was actually a plan. I didn't talk about it tonight. It's in the book. That was proposed in 1803 for a very different sort of island. It might have, to say it briefly, we might have had an island that was a bunch of Greenwich villages. You notice that Greenwich Village isn't congested. I don't think the whole island would have been congested. I think if we had not had the rectilinear grid, we would have had much more public transportation, and we wouldn't have had...
We have the best public transportation of any American city, and arguably, among any of the great world cities.
I'm not sure about that. I had a very difficult time getting here tonight.
We have more miles of systems serving with greater density.
It would be nice. It would be nice, for example, if the streets were not so congested with cars, that we had trams and other sorts of mass transportation that worked quickly on these streets.
Okay, but I don't think it's fair to argue that academics don't appreciate the grid or that it's not beautiful. It's a different kind of beautiful. But I would argue in contrast, whether it's Reps or any of the other historians that you mentioned is that they have a Eurocentric bias towards great either imperial or royal inscription on the land to protect aristocratic privilege, and that the grid is the most democratic.
I'm not sure how democratic it is. I'm not sure.
You can own it. You can own it.
I'm not sure John Jacob Astor. I'm not sure John Jacob Astor was a great Democrat. But I'm going to pass, because what I'm going to say is I'm a historian, and what I think what I show in the book is what has been called the greatest grid, and I worked on the catalog for the exhibit by that name. The grid is not as great as it is made out to be, and that we might, if it isn't so great, might feel less attached to it. So if we do want to reorganize this place at some point, whether by choice or by necessity, you can think about London Great Fire reorganizing itself. As an historian, I think my job is simply to show you how the grid came to be, that it wasn't so inspired as people think it was, and just to add that into your calculations if you're a politician or a planner or an architect or an intellectual or academic.
Other questions? I didn't mean to cut off.
Greenwich Village is a grid, it's just at a 45-degree angle, but it's still a grid.
It's gritty.
All the houses are rectilinear.
Yeah.
So I don't understand.
Yeah.
You know, are you advocating round houses, or people should have triangles, or I don't understand what.
Well,
you know, you can have a few triangular buildings and it's
Right.
nice, but
Right.
most people, you know, this room is a rectangle.
Mhm.
I mean, rectangle, you know, it's just all those wooden houses, those wooden farmhouses that you're showing, they were all rectangles. That's how when you have wood and you build a house, it's a rectangle. You know, unless you're Thomas Jefferson.
I guess what I'm saying is, that's good. Read the book and look at this. I guess I could just stop there. Read the book and look at this plan that could have become the plan of the city in 1803 by a guy named Joseph Francois Mangin, M-A-N-G-I-N. It's pronounced Mangin now. He was the architect of City Hall and numerous other things. City Hall is his building. And he, unasked for, came up with a future plan for the city. He was the first guy to think of actually planning the city. He actually wrote in 1798 that the plan he was working on, he'd been hired to make a plan of the existing city. Instead, he said, I am not making a plan of the city as it is, but as it shall be. And I think those are probably the first words ever written and perhaps even thought about planning in New York. And his idea was segments of rectilinear grid, like Greenwich Village, of varying densities. Some of these grids with short and narrow streets, some of these grids with wide and broad streets, but set at irregular angles to each other, and largely following some of the natural forms of the island, the natural topography of the island. And in these, that's a whole different subject.
But well, that's what those are. I mean, they're
right.
separate little areas of little grids at different angles.
Correct. And with Mangan's sort of patchwork quilt of grids, you would have had innumerable public spaces, in these sort of random public spaces that you find in European cities. And the argument is, would that have made, not allowed Manhattan to become the powerful place that it became? I would say that it was already becoming that. It was already by the early 1800s the number one city in the country. Could it have developed randomly, continued to develop randomly as it had until then? No. But could it have had a more organic planning than what it got? I would say, as an historian, maybe. How's that for a cop-out? Anyone else? Okay.
They gave numbers to streets and avenues.
Yeah.
giving them names.
Yeah.
Was that something that was authorized?
Well, that started on the west side. Well, Madison and Lexington, but it started on the west side with the avenues essentially by real estate interests. 8th Avenue, Central Park West sounded a lot nicer than 8th Avenue. Columbus sounded nicer than 9th. Amsterdam better than 10th. West End better than 11th. And as I write in the book, actually in the introduction, you don't actually have to read very deep into the book to get my take on that. I think we just naturally, as people, have a greater need for affinity with names and not numbers. And so to some extent, I think one of the more pleasant developments over the years of the grid is that so many street names have been attached to what were just ordinal numbers.
Not a single street in Paris has a number, it has a numeral on it. And when you walk along the boulevards, there are different angles cutting into the boulevards and magnificent buildings.
Mhm.
Trapezoid,
Yep.
triangular.
Yep.
And it just makes the buildings more attractive.
Exactly. And I think you would have had that.
Here we have rectangular.
You have
You-
trapezoids on Broadway.
Yeah, not that many.
Right.
What?
Well,
Not that many. You know, I mean, it just makes the buildings more important. It's
I
a more pleasurable experience when you stroll along. the boulevard.
I think we think similarly. Anyone else? All right.
Well, I do.
Oh, go ahead.
What happened to, as I take the picture, what happened to poor Randall? He had such a...
Oh, Randall, yeah. Randall was one of these exacting sort of guys that started as a surveyor, and what you wanted to do if you were a surveyor in those days is become a civil engineer. And so, like a lot of the surveyors who built the Erie Canal, who were not trained engineers, basically taught themselves to be engineers on the Erie Canal. And Randall was going to have an association with the Erie Canal. He wound up not. In fact, he wound up criticizing the chief engineer of the Erie Canal, saying he was making political decisions at the eastern end of the canal, which he probably was, Benjamin Wright, the so-called father of American civil engineering. But Randall was basically pushing up against a very formidable enemy. And a few years later, they found themselves working together on the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. They both applied to be the chief engineer. Wright got the job as chief engineer. Randall only got the job of chief contractor, essentially under Wright. And Wright hated Randall for what Randall had done a few years earlier, tried to do a few years earlier to him with the Erie Canal. And Wright got Randall fired entirely unfairly. Randall sued and eventually won $250,000, which nearly beggared the Delaware and the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal Company. And but Randall, over the years, frittered away all that money and died impoverished, largely because he was one of these guys that always had to be right. And he was the victim of many real but many more perceived slights. And when those happened to him, he sued. And he eventually became, by 1840 or so, he even wrote, I am a ruined man, in relation to something else. And he eventually died in 1864. Actually, we don't even know the exact date of his death. We actually don't even also know where he's buried. So he died very obscure, the guy who did all these fantastic maps and, for better or worse, laid out Manhattan in its greatest good or fair grid. Anyone else? All right, good.
What's your next book?
Oh, well, I'm working on that with my agent. You know, if I can't sell it to my agent, then there's no reason to do it. And I do have something in mind, but I don't really necessarily want to talk about it yet. Right?
Well, you'll keep us in suspense. Well, thank you now.
Okay.
Have a drink, buy a book.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, one second there. As people settle into the seats, welcome. For who's here for the first time at the Skyscraper Museum? Oh, a bunch of new people. Maybe you heard, maybe you heard Gerard speak on NPR the other day. I'm not sure how you found out about the Skyscraper Museum, but I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. So welcome, and those of you here for the first time, please look around after the talk. In fact, we have a reception after the talk with wine and water, and book signing, of course. So, but I hope some of you will not be guarding your seat, but actually roaming around, and I hope enjoying the exhibition. This one called 10 Tops, which is about the 24 buildings in the world that are 100 stories or taller, and not a top 10 list, but a 10 tops list to find out what happens at the very tops of those buildings. So here at the Skyscraper Museum, we alternate between historical exhibitions, and we love to focus on New York, and a more broad international scope and contemporary. For our book talks, of which this is the first of the winter-spring series, we do once a month a talk in the space here, and we love the intimacy. We're already full up, so I hope that this kind of enlarged seminar, is going to be stimulating and intimate at the same time. But we do a series of events in the space, and those of you who are not members of the museum, I certainly encourage you to become one, because some of the other events we do, like the Skyscraper seminars, which are directed principally at professional audiences of architects and engineers, but look in depth at single buildings that are described by their designers when they're under construction or recently completed, and really try to document the process of developing, designing, engineering, constructing buildings. So we like to alternate between our lay audiences and our professional audiences, between tourists and hardcore New Yorkers. And I think tonight is definitely on the hardcore New Yorker side of the population. And just to promote next month's event, which is only in 2 weeks, I think, 2 weeks from tonight, is an interesting and a divergent topic of something. This is not exactly a book, but Robert Bowen, who is a filmmaker and film historian, someone who teaches at the School of Visual Arts, is going to bring a project that he's been working on, which is called New York Background, and like 3D New York, and this kind of out-of-focus image on the postcard that we sent out is a film of Lower Manhattan. That's part of the Library of Congress. It's the Edison Archives of paper negatives of views of the waterfront of New York. It's from 1905, one of the earliest films. And he's turned that through a digitization process into a stereoscopic experience. So as if you were looking through old 19th century stereoscopes, you'll be able to watch this film, which was made on paper negatives in 3 dimensions, and it's kind of an experimental process. So I urge you to come back to that, because it's really something that we haven't done before, and that I've never seen before. So Bob and I will have a conversation about his process as well. And then we're going to range across South Street Seaport to affordable housing in the rest of the series for the spring. But tonight, City on a Grid, this book, which you hear because you already heard about, I know, is one that really goes back to the kind of the imprint on the island of the future of New York, as the point that you make in the book. And Gerard Koeppel has concentrated in his writings on the early history of New York, with looking at the Erie Canal, looking at water for Gotham, his previous book. And of course, City on a Grid celebrates the bicentennial, yes, 200-year anniversary of the 1811 grid plan, but it goes earlier. The book focuses on earlier than that, and the efforts to inscribe on the land a kind of, well, I'll let him describe that.
You can keep going now.
And he comes up to the present day, and I have to confess that I had to skip ahead to the very last chapter, and I really look forward to debating with you
Yes,
some
I
of the
think you
merits of the grid, because for me, the not just the image, but the most spectacular expression of New York lies in its grid and its vertical expression. So as to leave plenty of time for discussion afterwards, let's start with Gerard tonight.
Okay.